In verse 6, as we keep reading, now when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, "What does the sound of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. And so they asked themselves, "What's the screaming about? What's all this commotion?" And verse 7, so the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "God has come into this camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before." And verse 8, "Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians, with all the plagues in the wilderness." A couple things here to commend about the Philistines. The Philistines recognized that the ark represented the presence of God. In fact, they remembered history. They remembered the history of the ark and how the ark had given the Israelites power over the enemies of the Israelites. And this is 500 years later, and they're still recalling the plagues of Egypt here. And notice this, that their history is a little off here. They said that it was because of the ark that the Egyptians were struck with the plagues. But the ark wasn't actually built in Egypt. It was actually built 2 years later when the nation of Israel was in the wilderness. And verse 9 says this, "Be strong and conduct yourselves like men, you Philistines, that you do not become servants of the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Conduct yourselves like men and fight." So this is like those Braveheart scenes. The Philistines are rousing themselves to courage. Reminds me of World War II. It reminds me of when the Japanese realized when they were losing and they were going to lose in the war, they became desperate and they turned to kamikaze pilots. These were men that basically risked their lives to carry out suicide missions against Allied ships. And although 10 or 20% of these kamikaze pilots, these missions were successful, they sank some 50 Allied ships, even as they were losing the war. Christians can learn a good lesson from what the Philistines are saying here. The Philistines are encouraging their own to be strong and conduct themselves like men. When things look dire, do we as Christians, do we as believers, do we fight our spiritual battles in strength and power? Because the Philistines knew that. And how much more should children of God understand the power of God? In verse 10, as we keep reading, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was delivered. Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. There was a very great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. You know what's interesting here? God doesn't bless their superstitious ark belief at all. In fact, they lose even worse. In verse 2, they lost 4,000 men. Now they lose 30,000 men, 26,000 more after they bring the ark out. Imagine walking through that field. Think about the carnage. Think about the amount of bodies they're looking at as they're walking through and seeing how many men have died. If you're a skeptic, maybe you don't believe in the Bible, perhaps you have no desire to believe in the Bible and no concept of Christianity, and you think this is all just a big fairy tale, sounds like just a huge movie production that's completely fake. What's interesting? Archaeology actually confirms this battle. In the late 1970s, a 5-line inscription was found on a grain silo in the ruins of Izbet Sarte, which is basically a city near Aphek, which is mentioned in this chapter. When deciphered, it was found to contain a Philistine account of this battle, the capture of the ark, and even specifically mentioning the priest Hophni. This is the earliest known extra-biblical reference to an Old Testament event. Here's more. Excavations around Shiloh have uncovered evidence of a violent battle. Looking 1 meter deep into the ground, we see evidence of charred floors, fallen bricks, around the time of Samuel. And this was written about extensively by a guy named Todd Bolin in 2013, according to other passages in Scripture as well. The Philistines would go on to destroy Shiloh itself. Jeremiah 7:2 says that the tabernacle was destroyed. And Jeremiah 7:12, says this, "But go now to my place, which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. And verse 13, and now because you have done all these works, says the Lord, and I spoke to you, rising up early and speaking, but you did not hear, and I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore I will do to the house which is called by my name, in which you trust, and to this place which I gave to you and your fathers, as I have done to Shiloh. So in this same battle, somehow maybe a little later, Shiloh, the actual place where the tabernacle resides, will be destroyed. In verse 11, and also the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So in this battle, think about what's happening here. Great calamity befalls the nation. It can be equated to if the White House was destroyed in one day, or if DC suddenly was the subject of a terrorist attack. Calamity befalls the nation of Israel here in one day. The religious capital of the nation, Shiloh, is essentially destroyed. The tabernacle is destroyed. 34,000 men die. Leaders of the nation, Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas, they're all going to die today. The lesson for you and I is this. Sometimes God could send calamity our way, and it could actually be a good thing. Sometimes God could send calamity our way to get our attention and wake us up. You see, calamity is not always about sin. Don't get me wrong here. Good people face calamity too. But the question you and I should ask ourselves is this. How hard does God have to hit you to get your attention? How hard does God have to give you a slap in the face or a tug on your shoulder to wake you up and to make you see him? C.S. Lewis has this great quote. He says this, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciousness, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And notice how God did this. You see, the ark had become an idol, and Israel had turned this ark, which was a good thing, meant to point people to God, and they had turned that into an idol, an object of worship. And here's what God did. God took their idol away. He allowed their idol to be captured. And so often in our lives, isn't that how God deals with our idolatry? He allows it to be captured or crushed or cut off or destroyed. You see, an idol is anything that takes away our time, our attention, our affection, or energy from walking in God's will. John Calvin wrote, he said this famously, and it's a famous quote, the human heart is a perpetual idol factory. What idol is there in your life that maybe God is going to take away or needs to take away? Maybe it's a bad relationship. Maybe it's a bad habit. Maybe it's something you're doing to take time away from God. What is it that God needs to cut off from our life? And notice this, Hophni and Phinehas die here. These are the two sons of Eli. God had told Eli this would happen. This was proof of his judgment because he told Eli this would happen on the exact same day. He had told Eli that his sons would die in the very same day. And this is what happens.